Have you ever wondered what it's like to protect the wildest, most breathtaking places on Earth? To stand as a guardian for nature, fighting not just for the future of a park, but for something much bigger, our planet itself. This is the story of David Hayes, a man who dedicated his life to guarding the untamed beauty of Mount Bison, a national park he loved more than anything. But what happens when the very thing you cherish the most is threatened, not by nature, but by those closest to you? Today, we follow David on a journey of betrayal, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the wilderness. A journey that challenges everything he believes in, forcing him to face the darkest corners of human nature, and his own. Stay tuned, as we uncover how one man's strength, courage, and love for the land set him on a path that would change everything. In the wilderness of the vast Rocky Mountains, David Hayes, a seasoned forest ranger, spends his days protecting the land he loves. Known for his dedication to preserving the integrity of his park, Mount Bison National Forest, David's life takes an unexpected and heart-wrenching turn when he discovers that his wife, Julia, has been involved in an affair with a wealthy, influential businessman named Ethan Turner. The revelation sets off a chain of events that forces David to confront not only the collapse of his marriage but also a web of illegal activities threatening the park he's sworn to protect. David Hayes had always prided himself on his unwavering dedication to his job. A forest ranger in Mount Bison National Forest, his days were spent trekking through the rugged terrain, ensuring that the forest and #39's flora and fauna remained undisturbed. It was a life he loved, a life built around solitude, nature, and purpose. But all that changed one crisp autumn afternoon. David had been out on a routine patrol near the southern boundary of the park when he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: his wife, Julia, in the arms of Ethan Turner, a businessman known for his investments in the tourism industry. As David observed from a distance, the two were laughing, too close for comfort, in a secluded part of the forest. The moment felt like time had stopped. Stunned and furious, David didn't confront them. Instead, he quietly gathered evidence, knowing he needed proof before confronting Julia. The pain of betrayal cut deep, but he kept his focus on collecting the evidence, reminding himself that this wasn't just about his marriage, it was about standing up for what was right. Returning to his cabin that evening, David found Julia waiting for him, as if nothing was wrong. The guilt she was feeling was palpable, but she hadn't yet confessed. David, however, had no intention of letting her continue the deception. With a calmness he didn't feel, he confronted her, presenting the evidence he had gathered. Her reaction was a mix of surprise, guilt, and defensiveness. She admitted to the affair, but then went on to justify it, telling David how lonely she had felt, how she had grown distant from him. The weight of her betrayal was unbearable, and David felt as though the world he had carefully built was crumbling. But he didn't have time to wallow in grief. The following day, he was called in for an emergency rescue mission in the park. A wildfire had broken out near the eastern ridge, threatening a small village nestled just outside the park boundaries. For a moment, David considered resigning from his post. The pain of betrayal was consuming him, but he couldn't abandon his duty to protect the forest and the people who depended on it. With no time to waste, David geared up and joined the rescue operation. As he fought the fire, saving lives and ensuring the forest didn't fall victim to the flames, David found solace in the work. The heat and chaos of the fire were a brutal reminder of the fragility of life, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of clarity. As the fire subsided and the town was safe, David returned to his cabin, his thoughts still clouded by the betrayal. But fate had other plans. Late one night, he received an anonymous tip that would change everything. The tip hinted at illegal activities in the park, specifically, poaching and the illegal trade of endangered species. But the most shocking part was the involvement of none other than Ethan Turner. David knew Ethan's name was tied to luxury resorts, but he had no idea that the businessman had been involved in something far darker. The tip led David to a network of smugglers operating within the park, trafficking endangered wildlife for profit. He realized that Ethan wasn't just after a piece of the park for tourism, he was involved in a much more dangerous game. David quietly began investigating, using his knowledge of the park and his connections within the ranger community to gather information. He soon discovered that Julia had been more involved with Ethan than just an affair. She had been helping him cover up his illegal operations, using her connections to bypass regulations and authorities. The betrayal ran deeper than David had imagined. David knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. He reached out to his trusted colleague, Rachel Walker, a fellow ranger and close friend who had always supported him through thick and thin. Together, they worked to gather more evidence, quietly documenting the illegal activities and preparing to bring it to the authorities. But the closer they got to exposing Ethan's operation, the more dangerous things became. Ethan's wealth and influence were vast, and David realized that taking him down wouldn't be easy. As the investigation progressed, David's personal life spiraled further out of control. Julia's guilt-driven attempts at reconciliation only fueled his anger. He could no longer look at her without seeing the woman who had helped destroy everything he believed in. Julia's confession came in an unexpected moment of weakness, when she admitted to David that she was pregnant with Ethan's child. David's world shattered once again. In that moment, he knew that their marriage was beyond repair. But he couldn't allow that to stop him from doing what needed to be done to protect the park. The final confrontation came when David and Rachel uncovered undeniable proof that Ethan was not only involved in wildlife trafficking, but was also plotting to sell portions of the park's land to corporate developers. This would lead to massive destruction of the environment and the livelihoods of the people who depended on the forest. David knew they had to act quickly. In a calculated move, David gathered the evidence and presented it to the authorities, including the media. The exposure of Ethan's crimes sent shockwaves through the business community, and Ethan was arrested. Julia, too, faced legal consequences for her involvement in the illegal activities. The truth was out, and the park was safe, for now. David's fight for justice didn't end with Ethan's arrest. He led a campaign to secure more funding and protection for Mount Bison National Forest, ensuring that the park would remain untouched by corporate greed and exploitation. He became a symbol of resilience, not only in his professional life but in his personal journey of healing. Julia, now facing the consequences of her actions, tried to reach out to David, but he remained firm in his decision. He filed for divorce, knowing that he couldn't continue a life with someone who had betrayed him in such a profound way. The emotional scars would take time to heal, but David knew that he had to focus on the forest, the one thing that had never let him down. In the years that followed, David continued to serve as a ranger at Mount Bison. He built strong relationships with his team and the local community, working tirelessly to ensure the park's survival. While his personal life had been shattered, he found peace in his work and in the forest that had always been his sanctuary. David stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast expanse of Mount Bison National Forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. The park, the land he had dedicated his life to, was safe, for now. But he knew the fight was never truly over. There would always be those who sought to exploit nature for their own gain. But David, now more resolved than ever, was ready for whatever came next. As the stars began to twinkle above, David took a deep breath. He had lost so much, but he had also found a new sense of purpose. His life, though marked by hardship, was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and the power of the wild that would always be worth protecting. After the dust settled from Ethan's arrest, Mount Bison National Forest was, for the moment, safe from exploitation. However, David knew that his victory was only one battle in a much larger war. Corporate developers were not easily deterred, and there were always new threats lurking in the shadows. The park needed constant vigilance, and David was more determined than ever to ensure its survival. As he sat in his office at the ranger station, going over the park's latest budget proposals, his mind wandered to the personal cost of his efforts. The emptiness he felt without Julia was palpable. He had poured so much of himself into the fight for justice and the preservation of Mount Bison that he hadn't allowed himself to properly grieve the end of his marriage. It was as if the pain had been compartmentalized, waiting for the right moment to surface. That moment came when David received an unexpected phone call. It was from Rachel, his trusted colleague and friend. She informed him that there was a new threat to the park, one even more dangerous than corporate greed. A group of rogue poachers had infiltrated the park, and they were targeting the rare species that David had worked so hard to protect. The poaching was systematic and well organized, with rumors of an underground network selling the endangered animals on the black market. David knew what he had to do. His personal pain would have to be put aside for the time being. The park needed him, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. The investigation into the poaching ring was painstaking. David, along with Rachel, started gathering intelligence from local sources, quietly speaking to tourists and other park rangers, hoping to uncover any leads. The deeper they delved into the situation, the more they realized how extensive the operation was. Not only were animals being killed for their pelts, tusks, and bones, but the poachers were also poisoning the very water sources that sustained the wildlife. David was determined to stop them, but he knew that he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to other law enforcement agencies, including federal wildlife protection officers and the FBI, to help build a case. It was an arduous process, filled with close calls and dangerous encounters, but David was unwavering. Each step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. During a particularly intense surveillance mission, David and Rachel were ambushed by a group of poachers. The confrontation was brief but violent. Rachel was injured, and David had to make a split-second decision: get Rachel to safety or take down the poachers. He chose Rachel, pulling her out of harm's way and retreating to regroup. The experience shook him to his core. This wasn't just about protecting the land anymore, it was about protecting lives, including his own. Rachel's injury kept her off the field for several weeks, and David had to carry on the fight alone. The days were long, and the burden of the job weighed heavily on him. But as he got closer to dismantling the poaching ring, a sense of purpose began to fill the void left by Julia's departure. The fight for the forest was no longer just a job, it was his life's calling. After months of painstaking work, David and his team finally gathered enough evidence to take down the poaching network. It was an operation that involved coordinated raids across multiple states, with wildlife officers, local law enforcement, and federal agents all working together to make the arrests. The night before the operation, David stood at the edge of Mount Bison, looking out over the land he had sworn to protect. In that moment, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The heartbreak, the betrayal, and the overwhelming pressure to save his home, all of it had led to this one final act. David knew that while the fight against the poachers would soon come to an end, there would always be another threat, another challenge. But that was the nature of the work he had chosen. The next day, the raid was a success. The poaching network was completely dismantled, and the people responsible were arrested and charged. The endangered species that had been targeted for so long were safe once again. David had done what he had set out to do: he had protected the park, and more importantly, he had protected its future. In the aftermath of the successful operation, David took some time to reflect on everything he had been through. The personal pain of his betrayal by Julia was still there, but it had faded into the background, no longer consuming him. He had learned to accept that life wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about how you moved forward, how you found purpose in the aftermath. David started to open up more to his team, sharing the weight of his experiences and encouraging others to do the same. The forest, once a place of solitude and escape, had become his sanctuary once again, not because it healed his wounds, but because it had taught him to be resilient, to fight for what mattered most, and to appreciate the small moments of peace. He began to find joy in the simple things: hiking the trails, sitting quietly by the river, and teaching young rangers the importance of preserving the wilderness. David was no longer the man he had been when he first started. He was stronger, wiser, and more connected to the land than ever before. Months passed, and David continued to lead his team with an unwavering commitment to the park. The poaching ring had been broken, but the work wasn't over. David and Rachel worked together to secure more funding for conservation programs, ensuring that Mount Bison National Forest would remain protected for generations to come. As for Julia, David heard little about her in the years that followed. She moved away, and while David occasionally wondered about her, he knew that chapter of his life was closed. He had learned that some relationships weren't meant to last, and that didn't define who you were, it was how you lived in the face of adversity that mattered most. David found peace not in the absence of pain, but in his ability to face it head-on and continue fighting for something greater than himself. He was no longer just a ranger, he was a guardian of the wild, and that title gave him the strength to move forward. As David stood at the top of a ridge one final time, looking out over Mount Bison National Forest, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The forest, vast and untamed, stretched out before him. It was a reminder of the fragility of the world he had sworn to protect, and the resilience of the human spirit. David had lost a great deal in his life, but through it all, he had never lost sight of his true calling. The wilderness was his home, and he would continue to fight for it, no matter the cost. And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, David felt a deep sense of peace. The future was uncertain, but he was ready for whatever came next. The forest was his, and he was its guardian, now and forever. The seasons began to shift once again, and with it came a new rhythm of life in Mount Bison National Forest. David was no longer the broken man who had once stood on the precipice of losing everything he loved. The pain of betrayal had, over time, morphed into a distant memory, now part of the landscape of his past. Yet, even as the months passed, David couldn't help but feel that something was missing. Perhaps it was a deeper connection to others, or the desire for a new challenge. As autumn painted the forest in shades of red and gold, David found himself contemplating a new role, one that would allow him to expand his impact beyond the park. He had received an invitation to speak at an environmental conservation summit in Washington, D.C., an event that brought together the top minds in conservation, politics, and corporate philanthropy. It was an opportunity to advocate for Mount Bison's future, but also for the future of national parks across the country. Despite his initial hesitations about stepping out of his comfort zone, David knew that this was a chance to take his passion for conservation to a broader audience. It was time to share the lessons he had learned, the battles he had fought, and the deep respect he had for the natural world that had sustained him through his darkest moments. The summit was everything David had anticipated and more. The atmosphere was charged with the energy of ambitious leaders, each with their own vision for the future of environmental conservation. David was a bit of an outsider in the room, a man of the earth, used to the solitude of the mountains, now thrust into a world of policy debates, funding pitches, and strategic alliances. However, as he took the stage to deliver his speech, he found his voice. Standing before a crowd of well-dressed professionals, politicians, and environmental activists, David felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He spoke not just as a ranger, but as a guardian of something sacred, the land, the animals, the future. His words carried the weight of years of experience, of fires fought, poachers thwarted, and lives saved. He spoke passionately about Mount Bison National Forest, about the importance of preserving untouched wilderness, about the threats posed by development and exploitation. But most importantly, he spoke about resilience, the resilience of the land and the resilience of people who, like him, had dedicated their lives to its preservation. "I stand before you today," David said, his voice steady and clear, "not just to ask for more funding or support for our national parks, but to remind you of something we all too often forget: we are stewards of the earth, and our responsibility is not just to protect what we have, but to leave a legacy for those who come after us. The choices we make today will shape the world for future generations." The room was silent as his words resonated through the air. It wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. David left the summit with new allies, newfound respect, and a reinforced belief that his work in the park was just one part of a much larger, global mission. As David returned to Mount Bison, he was met with a new wave of challenges. The funding secured from the summit had opened up opportunities for research, education, and further expansion of conservation efforts, but it also brought increased scrutiny. The eyes of the nation were now on Mount Bison National Forest, and with that spotlight came a new level of responsibility. David's leadership was tested as he navigated the politics of park management. Not all of the park's stakeholders shared his vision of preserving the forest in its purest form. Developers, despite the setbacks from Ethan's failed attempts, were still eager to find ways to profit off the land. Some argued that limited commercial development would bring in much-needed revenue to support the park's operations. David found himself in heated discussions with policymakers, park administrators, and even fellow conservationists, each with different ideas about the future of Mount Bison. But through it all, his resolve remained unshaken. He knew what was at stake, and he wasn't willing to compromise on his vision. The fight for the forest was far from over, but now, David was more prepared than ever to face it head-on. It had been over a year since David had last seen Rachel, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief when he received a call from her. Her recovery from the poacher ambush had been long, but she was finally ready to return to work. Rachel had always been more than just a colleague, she had been a friend and a partner in protecting the park. As she returned to the ranger team, it was clear that her presence brought a sense of balance to David's life. The challenges ahead were immense, but with Rachel by his side, David felt more confident than ever. Together, they began training a new generation of park rangers, instilling in them not just the technical skills necessary to protect the park, but the deep respect for nature that had been David's guiding principle. One crisp morning, as they stood on the ridge overlooking the forest, Rachel turned to David with a knowing smile. "You've come a long way," she said. David gazed out over the forest, his mind filled with memories of the struggles he had faced and the battles he had won. He had learned to navigate his personal pain, to find strength in the wilderness, and to fight for the preservation of something greater than himself. But it was in moments like this, standing with friends, united in a shared mission, that he realized he wasn't alone. "We've come a long way," David replied. "And we still have a long way to go." Years passed, and David's work in Mount Bison continued to shape the future of conservation efforts. Under his leadership, the park expanded its educational outreach programs, reaching thousands of students and inspiring the next generation of environmental stewards. The funding secured at the summit allowed for the implementation of cutting-edge conservation technology, monitoring endangered species, and maintaining the integrity of the park's delicate ecosystems. David's name became synonymous with the fight for national parks, and while he never sought fame, his dedication to the land he loved brought him recognition across the country. He was invited to more summits, more speaking engagements, but his heart remained in Mount Bison. One evening, as David walked the familiar trails of the park, he reflected on the legacy he was building, not just through policy or recognition, but through the young rangers he mentored, the research he helped facilitate, and the countless acts of conservation that ensured the land would remain protected for generations to come. The forest was still wild, still untamed, and that was exactly as it should be. David Hayes was no longer just the man who had suffered betrayal or the ranger fighting to protect his home. He had become a living testament to the power of resilience, to the idea that even after loss, there could still be redemption and renewal. And with every step he took in the forest, David knew that he was leaving a legacy that would outlive him. As the years passed, Mount Bison National Forest became one of the most well-preserved parks in the country. Thanks to David's leadership, it was more than just a sanctuary for wildlife, it became a model for other parks, a shining example of what could be achieved when passion and persistence came together. However, with success came new pressures. As Mount Bison gained recognition, the demands on David grew. The park was now attracting more visitors than ever, and the burden of managing the increased traffic, securing funding for new initiatives, and keeping the park protected weighed heavily on him. While David had always been a man of action, he found himself more often behind a desk, poring over reports, dealing with politics, and negotiating with local and federal authorities. It was a role he had never imagined for himself, and it left him feeling disconnected from the work he loved. Rachel, now a senior ranger, noticed the toll it was taking on him. She found him late one evening, staring at his computer screen, looking worn out. "David," she said softly, "you're burning yourself out. You need a break." David ran a hand through his hair and leaned back in his chair. "I can't afford a break, Rachel. There's too much at stake. We're fighting battles on so many fronts: funding, conservation laws, tourism management. If I let up, even for a second, we could lose everything we've worked for." Rachel sat down across from him. "I get it. But don't forget why you started this in the first place. You didn't do it to sit in meetings and sign papers. You did it because you care about this place, and you care about the people and animals that rely on it. Don't let the system turn you into something you're not." David looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right, but the path forward wasn't clear. How could he keep fighting for the forest without becoming part of the bureaucracy that threatened to smother its very essence? Just when David thought he couldn't handle any more pressure, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A team of international environmental scientists reached out to him with an invitation to join a global expedition aimed at studying climate change's effects on remote ecosystems. The project would take him far from the comforts of Mount Bison and provide a new lens through which to view the challenges he faced. At first, David hesitated. He had always been devoted to Mount Bison, and leaving it, even temporarily, felt like abandoning his responsibilities. But after discussing it with Rachel and reflecting on her advice, he realized that this could be the chance he needed. Not only could he gain new insights into global environmental issues, but it would also give him the break he desperately needed to recharge and reconnect with the core of his mission. He agreed to join the expedition, and soon he found himself traveling to remote regions in South America, Africa, and the Arctic. The trip was grueling, but it was also eye-opening. He saw firsthand how climate change was ravaging ecosystems across the globe, how species that had once thrived were now at risk of extinction. He also witnessed the tireless work of conservationists in other parts of the world, and the deep sense of community they shared in their fight for nature. David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this battle. There were millions of people across the world who cared about the same issues he did. He returned to Mount Bison with fresh ideas, new strategies, and a broader perspective on the challenges that lay ahead. Back at Mount Bison, David applied the lessons he had learned from his global expedition. He introduced new initiatives to reduce the carbon footprint of the park, working with local governments to implement more sustainable practices. He also formed new alliances with international environmental organizations, advocating for global policies that would protect wilderness areas like Mount Bison. But with new allies came new challenges. As David worked to integrate Mount Bison's conservation efforts into a larger global framework, he encountered resistance from powerful corporate interests, some of whom had become even more determined to exploit natural resources for profit. These companies didn't care about the forest, its animals, or the long-term consequences of their actions. They only cared about short-term gains. David found himself facing the toughest moral dilemma of his career. The park was under threat in ways it never had been before, and the corporations had deep pockets and influential connections. He couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed help. In his search for allies, David reached out to other national park rangers, environmental activists, and even politicians who had a genuine interest in preserving the country's natural heritage. With their help, David organized a national campaign to protect public lands, calling on people to join the movement and defend the wild spaces that were being encroached upon by corporate greed. The campaign was a massive success. Thousands of people rallied behind Mount Bison, and the movement grew into a powerful force for conservation. David found himself in the spotlight once again, speaking at rallies, appearing in news interviews, and working tirelessly to build public support. His message was simple but powerful: the health of the planet was inextricably linked to the health of its wild spaces, and if we lost those spaces, we lost a part of ourselves. Through his efforts, David was able to push back against the corporations threatening the park. He secured new protections for Mount Bison and helped pass legislation that safeguarded public lands across the nation. But the victory was hard-won, and it came at a cost. David's life became a whirlwind of public appearances and meetings, and he struggled to find time for himself, for his work on the ground in the park, and for the people who had stood by him through it all. As the years went on, David realized that the key to his success, and his happiness, lay in finding balance. He couldn't do it all on his own, and he had to learn to delegate, to trust others to take on some of the weight of leadership. Rachel had become more than just a colleague, she had become a trusted partner in every sense of the word. Together, they developed a network of rangers, scientists, and conservationists who worked alongside them to protect Mount Bison. David also began to rekindle relationships he had neglected over the years. He spent more time with his family and friends, learning to appreciate the moments of peace and connection that had once been overshadowed by his single-minded pursuit of his mission. He still loved the forest with all his heart, but he knew that he couldn't give everything to it and expect to remain whole. In time, David found a rhythm between his responsibilities at Mount Bison, his advocacy work, and his personal life. He continued to fight for the preservation of the natural world, but he did so with the knowledge that true change required not just action, but compassion and balance. As David entered his late 40s, he had become a symbol of perseverance. His accomplishments were many, but he had come to understand that it was not just about victories on paper, it was about the day-to-day decisions that shaped the future of Mount Bison National Forest and, more broadly, the future of conservation itself. One evening, after a long day of meetings and project reviews, David sat by a campfire just outside the park headquarters. He looked up at the sky, the stars sparkling above him as they always had. He found peace in the familiarity of the forest. Its smells, sounds, and rhythms had become a part of his very being. Rachel, who had been working on a new initiative for community involvement in park management, joined him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each processing the weight of the day's events in their own way. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "There's an opportunity on the horizon, David. A big one. They want you to run for the position of Director of the National Park Service. It would mean overseeing all the national parks in the country." David's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. It was a huge responsibility, a far cry from the solitude of Mount Bison. Being in a position like that would mean navigating the bureaucracy of national governance, dealing with politicians, and making decisions that affected parks far beyond his beloved forest. "I'm not sure," he said after a long pause. "I've spent so many years fighting for Mount Bison. It's my home. Can I leave it behind to take on something so much larger?" Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression one of understanding. "You don't have to leave it behind. You could take the fight for Mount Bison, and the fight for all our parks, to a much larger stage. This could be your chance to change things for the better across the whole country, to make sure that our parks get the protection they deserve." David's mind whirled. The idea was daunting, but it also filled him with a sense of purpose. Could he truly make a difference on such a large scale? Was this the right time for him to step into such a monumental role? After much deliberation, David made his decision. He would apply for the role of Director of the National Park Service. But there was one thing he was certain of: he couldn't leave Mount Bison behind. He knew he needed to remain involved with the forest he loved, even as he worked on a larger stage. David and Rachel devised a plan. He would keep an active role in the park, focusing on key projects while still overseeing the broader conservation agenda. He would remain the heart of Mount Bison, but also be an advocate for every national park in the country. The balance would be difficult, but David believed it was the right path forward. The application process was grueling. There were extensive interviews, an examination of his record, and countless meetings with policymakers and stakeholders. But David's passion for the land, his unyielding commitment to conservation, and his reputation as a fierce advocate for public lands stood out. Eventually, he was offered the position of Director of the National Park Service. David's transition to the national stage was both exciting and overwhelming. On his first day as the director, he was greeted by a team of highly skilled individuals, policy experts, financial analysts, and conservation strategists, all eager to help him navigate the complexities of the role. But David knew that the key to success was not just in navigating politics or managing budgets, it was in keeping the heart of conservation alive. He began touring national parks across the country, visiting iconic places like the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, and the Everglades, listening to rangers, scientists, and local communities. He wanted to understand the unique challenges facing each park, from the growing threats of climate change to the pressures of increasing tourism. In every park he visited, David saw the same patterns: overexploitation, lack of resources, and political opposition. But he also saw something else: hope. Hope in the faces of the rangers who cared deeply about the land they protected, hope in the communities who relied on the parks for jobs and recreation, and hope in the new generation of conservationists who were ready to carry the torch forward. David's message was simple but powerful: national parks were more than just tourist destinations, they were vital to the health of the planet and the well-being of future generations. He pushed for increased funding, more sustainable practices, and policies that emphasized conservation over exploitation. The opposition was fierce, but David and #39's resolve only grew stronger. He leaned on the lessons he had learned from his time at Mount Bison, the importance of community, of partnerships, and of persistence. Even with his national responsibilities, David continued to nurture Mount Bison's future. Rachel, now one of the lead rangers at the park, had taken on more of the day-to-day management, but David was still deeply involved. He made regular visits, often staying for weeks at a time, ensuring that the park's preservation efforts remained on track. During one visit, David stood at the edge of Mount Bison, overlooking the sprawling forest below. It was a clear, crisp morning, and the mountain peaks were bathed in golden sunlight. He felt a deep sense of connection to the land, but also a growing sense of pride in how far they had come. This was not just a place he had saved, it was a symbol of what could be accomplished when people work together for a cause greater than themselves. Mount Bison had become a model for other parks, a testament to the power of grassroots conservation efforts. And David knew that his work wasn't done yet. As he expanded his vision to protect national parks across the country, Mount Bison remained at the center of that vision. Its lessons, its triumphs, and its struggles were woven into the very fabric of his approach to conservation. Years passed, and David's role as director of the National Park Service became increasingly influential. The policies he championed helped secure funding for national parks, protect endangered species, and combat the growing threats of climate change. More importantly, he was able to create a system that ensured the park's natural beauty and biodiversity would be preserved for generations to come. But as the years went on, David began to think more about the future of the conservation movement. He was no longer just fighting for Mount Bison, he was fighting for the entire national park system, for the land, the animals, and the people who relied on these spaces. And he knew that, eventually, he would have to step aside and allow someone new to take the reins. As his term as director of the National Park Service drew to a close, David looked back on the battles he had fought, the people he had met, and the countless moments of beauty he had witnessed in the wild spaces he had protected. He had made a difference, and his legacy would live on through the policies he had helped enact, the rangers he had mentored, and the parks he had saved. David's final act was to pass the torch to a new generation of leaders, those who would continue his work, but also bring fresh ideas and new energy to the fight. As he walked away from the National Park Service, he returned to Mount Bison, knowing that his work had ensured the future of the park he loved. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves in Mount Bison began to change color, David sat in front of the park headquarters, watching the tall trees stretch toward the sky in the soft light. Although he had retired from his position as the director of the National Park Service, his heart remained tied to Mount Bison, and returning to live within this natural sanctuary was a decision he would never regret. At the same time, a group of new rangers, young and passionate, had joined the park's team. They were individuals David had mentored over the years. Among them was Emma, a young woman with immense passion and determination to protect the natural world. She had been entrusted with important projects, taking over major conservation initiatives that David had started years ago. David had taught Emma everything he could, and today, she came to visit him to share an important decision. David, Emma said as she sat beside him, we've completed the Southern Ecological Area Protection Project, and it's received major national support. We are nearing securing significant funding from the Nature Fund to protect wildlife and prevent habitat destruction. This is a huge milestone. David smiled, his eyes lighting up as he listened to Emma and her team's accomplishments. That's great, Emma. You've all done amazing work. But remember, protecting an area isn't just about funding or policies. It's about the people, it's about the shift in mindset, in each of our hearts. I've seen plenty of losses, but I've also seen hope. You and your team are the ones who carry that hope forward. Emma thanked David and promised to continue following the example he had set. One morning, the spring breeze gently swept through the towering trees of Mount Bison, and David prepared for a significant event. He had decided to host a farewell ceremony at the park, not just to look back on his achievements but also to pass on the responsibility to the next generation. The ceremony took place on a hilltop, where David and his rangers had once fought side by side to protect the park. Under the clear sky, they reflected on the hardships and triumphs they had experienced together. It was here that David spoke his final farewell to the park, with all the love and respect he had for it. I've spent my life protecting this place, David said, his voice steady and deep. But now I realize that protecting nature isn't a solitary journey. We need a community, a united team. And I trust that all of you, these passionate young people, will continue fighting for the future of this place. This is not the end, it's a transition. David officially handed over the leadership to Emma, the one person he trusted to carry on the work of protecting the park for years to come. Once again, he saw in Emma's eyes the hope and resilience he had once had when he first began his conservation journey. David no longer returned to work after that ceremony. He transitioned to a quieter life, spending time with family, old friends, and occasionally visiting the park, where he had witnessed so many efforts to preserve the land. However, he could never fully detach from the cause. In his final years, he continued to engage in activities that raised awareness in the community and wrote books sharing his experiences, continuing to spread his love and responsibility for protecting the planet. On one final morning before he completely retired from Mount Bison, David stood on top of a hill, looking out over the entire park. The early light bathed the mountain peaks, and the quiet of the forest was almost palpable, as if time itself had stopped. He took a deep breath, feeling at peace with everything around him. "Thank you, Mount Bison," he whispered. "You've been my home." David Hayes knew that he had done everything he could, and his journey had reached its conclusion. But the values he instilled would live on through future generations, through people like Emma and her colleagues. And so, the story of a man who loved nature came to an end, but the larger story of conservation and protection of nature would continue. David Hayes' journey reminds us all of the power of resilience, the importance of protecting what we love, and the strength it takes to overcome even the deepest betrayals. His story is one of transformation, not just of the land he fought for, but of his own heart. Now that you've seen David's journey, we want to hear from you. What do you think about his fight to protect Mount Bison? Can you relate to his struggle for justice and redemption? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with others who love great stories, and of course, subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales like this one. Thanks for watching, and remember, stories of strength and courage are out there in the wild, waiting to be discovered. Stay tuned for more, and see you next time.